Hello, and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 Years. Today we are in Hebrews chapter 7. This is an enigmatic chapter on Melchizedek. Melchizedek really isn't mentioned very much at all in the Bible. He appears very briefly and mysteriously in Genesis 14. He's mentioned very ambiguously, or maybe not ambiguously, but very um, here and gone in Psalm 110:4. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. We're going to see that in this chapter, of course, and it was in Hebrews chapter 5. And then here in Hebrews 7, Melchizedek features. Who was this Melchizedek? Well, that's a great question. Of course, many thinkers throughout the centuries thought Melchizedek was a Christophany, a kind of Jesus cameo, where Jesus appears on the scene to Abraham and then disappears. Of course, that is one interpretation of Hebrews 7. I don't think it's the most natural interpretation of Hebrews 7. Melchizedek is a cryptic figure. He's a priest of El Elyon, of God Most High, which makes perfect sense to me because Abraham doesn't have the Bible, and Melchizedek doesn't have the Bible. So their understanding of God has to be God meeting them where they're at. And where are they at? Well, they're in a very polytheistic context in 2000 BC, 1800 BC, whatever time frame we're talking about here. And so it makes perfect sense that the way that God would reveal himself to them is by, well, he's the highest God. He's El Elyon. He's God Most High, the King of the gods. That's not a perfect understanding. It's not a completely wrong one, though, is it? And so we find, I think, that God gives a more and more precise understanding of him as we move through history. But at the time of Melchizedek, God Most High was the best way going, right? Because God revealed himself as Yahweh to Moses. In Genesis 6, it says that Abraham didn't know God as Yahweh. At least that's one interpretation of Genesis 6. Is it Genesis 6:3? Exodus 6:3, I think it is, somewhere in there, that God revealed himself to Moses as Yahweh. Well, all of that is kind of a little taste of the puzzles of Hebrews 7. Let's dive right in, shall we? And if you're looking at the video, you're seeing interlinearbible.org. If you're listening to the podcast, I don't know what you're looking at. All right, let's dive in with verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, the one who met Abraham when he was returning from the slaughter of the kings, and the one who blessed Abraham. Okay, so there we get the character of Melchizedek on the stage there. He's the king of Salem. Of course, tradition would have that being Jerusalem, right? King of Jerusalem. Of course, it's not known as Jerusalem in the time of Abraham. In fact, it's a Jebusite city until David takes it way much later. That kind of blew my mind when I first realized that Jerusalem wasn't always an Israelite city. It wasn't a Abraham city. There weren't Israelites until Abraham gave birth to them, right? So it's just a city. It's an old city, but it's not a Christian city because Christ hasn't come yet, and it's not a Jewish city because Israelites don't exist yet. He's the king of Salem, priest of El Elyon, of God Most High. You remember the story in Genesis 14. Abraham leads a group of people to war to defend themselves against, is it Kedorlaomer? I'm trying to remember, but they go out and defend successfully themselves and bring back people who've been enslaved. Right, verse 2. Let's continue to get the story from Genesis 6 on the page here. To whom also, Melchizedek, a tenth from everything, Abraham a portion. Abraham gave Melchizedek a tithe of his spoils. First, on the one hand, that is Melchizedek, being translated king of righteousness, Melchizedek. Zedek, righteousness, and then Melchi, my king, my king. It could mean Melchizedek. It could mean my king is righteous. Um, Hebrews takes it as king of righteousness. Now, what Hebrews is doing here is Hebrews is doing a little, I would say, allegory. Now, people break out in a hive when you talk about the New Testament using allegory, but get over yourself. It's an allegory. Deal with it. This is okay. It's inspired. But basically, the author of Hebrews is saying, what does Melchizedek represent in the text of Genesis 14? Well, first of all, Melchizedek, whoever this Melchizedek is, he symbolizes a king of righteousness. All right, hold that thought. Then also a king of Salem. Well, shalom, peace. He is a king of peace. So again, he's interpreting the Genesis 14 text. This is not how we generally interpret the text. And if you go to an evangelical college, and I should be clear, I've taught at evangelical institutions my whole life, I get it. But they're like, no, read it in context, read it in context. I'm sorry, this is an ancient Jewish way of interpreting scripture, and God met them where they were at. It's inspired, deal with it. He is allegorizing the text. So Melchizedek in the text of Genesis 14, he's the king of shalom. He's the king of peace. So what is it? What he's getting at here is, what is a priest after the order of Melchizedek like? What are the characteristics of a priest after the order of Melchizedek? Well, a priest after the order of Melchizedek is going to be a king of righteousness, because Melchizedek means king of righteousness. And a priest after the order of Melchizedek is going to be a king of peace, because he's the king of Salem. Shalom. Again, it's allegory. Deal with it. This is not historical critical exegesis. This is not context. Hebrews isn't reading it in context. Who cares? God inspired it. God can do this. Deal with it. Get over yourself. He is a king of righteousness. He is a king of peace. That's what a king of Melchizedek priest is. A Melchizedek priest is a king of righteousness, and a Melchizedek priest is a king of peace. Okay, verse 3. He is without father, without mother, without genealogy. Where did this guy come from? Genesis doesn't tell us who his parents are. Genesis doesn't tell us. How can he be a priest? I mean, priests have to be born of priests, right? It's passed down in the family. It's genealogical. So how can Melchizedek be a priest? But a priest after the order of Melchizedek doesn't have a priestly father, doesn't have a priestly mother, doesn't have a priestly genealogy. Do you see? He's building up how Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, even though he's not a priest. We're gonna get there. He's without father, he's without mother. He doesn't have a priestly genealogy. He doesn't have a beginning of days or end of life. When was he installed? Genesis doesn't tell us. By the way, this is an argument from silence. There's a Jewish rule of interpretation. Again, this won't fly. Don't do this on your exegesis paper in college. You won't get a good grade from the professor. But this is good old Jewish exegesis in the first century, and he's inspired. He can do it. The Genesis, it's called non in Torah, non in mundo. If it's not written in the Torah, we can say exegetically it doesn't exist. And so since the Genesis 14 text doesn't tell us when Melchizedek started in office, and it doesn't tell us when Melchizedek left office, therefore, for exegetical purposes, we can say that he doesn't have a priestly father or a mother. He doesn't have a beginning of going into office or a time when he leaves the office. But having been likened to the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. This is exegetical. Now, there are other ways to interpret this, of course. I've already mentioned the Christophany interpretation. The Christophany interpretation is the idea that Melchizedek actually was Jesus. And that when we say that he was without father, without mother, without genealogy, neither having beginning, that we're making a theological statement about how Jesus was eternally begotten by the Father, and he will eternally, So I believe those things as a Christian. I believe that Jesus was eternally begotten of the Father. I believe that he is the second person of the Trinity. However, I think that's vastly eisegetical. Now, I could be wrong. There are people who disagree with me. I just don't think that's what the text is talking about. I think that's us bringing our Council of Nicaea, Council of Chalcedon, hindsight is 2020, after the fact, 300, 400 years later, taking stuff that we believe as Christians and and anachronistically reading it into a much earlier text. Now, there are those, I'm trying to remember, I think it's Jerome Nere, who argues that a Jew hearing verse 3 would immediately think, oh, Jesus is divine. So Nere makes a good case from, actually, a lot of his arguments are from literature after the New Testament. But he argues that a Greek person hearing these words, without father, without mother, would immediately think, oh, Jesus is a divine, pre-existent being. Maybe, I'm not sure that is, whether we have any clues that that's what the text is thinking. But Nere would say, well, it was in the context of the history. And so he might be right. But I've always gone with he's making an exegetical argument that what the author of Hebrews is doing here is he knows that Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. He gets that from Psalm 110:4. So Psalm 110:1 was very important for the early Christians. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for my feet. That was, I wonder if that was the verse that really did a lot of heavy lifting in the early church when they were trying to understand the significance of the resurrection, because they weren't expecting the resurrection, right? Wow, where did that come from? And so they understood Jesus to have been enthroned in the heavens, to have been seated at the right hand of God the Father in the heavens as king. And so somebody at some point, maybe it was the author of Hebrews. I mean, we have no evidence of anybody doing this before Hebrews. It may have been an inspired point that the author of Hebrews himself got, but somebody read on down in the Psalm 110:1, everybody understood was Jesus. But Psalm 110:4 says, you are a priest forever, ever after the order of Melchizedek. The author of Hebrews or somebody thought, hey, Jesus is not only a sacrifice, he's the priest. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek, which raises the question, well, what is a priest after the order of Melchizedek? And this is the question that the author of Hebrews has answered. What is a priest after the order of Melchizedek? We know that Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek because Psalm 110:1 is about Jesus, right? So what is a priest after the order of Melchizedek? And so the author of Hebrews goes back to Genesis 14, the only other place in the Bible where Melchizedek is mentioned, and he begins to go to allegorical exegesis. What does the text tell me about Melchizedek? What can I infer, the author of Hebrews asks, from Genesis 14 about a priest after the order of Melchizedek? And he starts doing his allegorical interpretation. Well, okay, Melchizedek means king of righteousness. So a priest after the order of Melchizedek is a king of righteousness. And he's from Salem, Shalom. So a priest after the order of Melchizedek is a king of peace. And what doesn't Genesis 14 tell us? Because exegetically, that can tell me also what a priest after the order of Melchizedek is. Well, Melchizedek doesn't have a priestly genealogy. He doesn't have a priestly father. He doesn't have a Levitical mother. And so we know, therefore, that a priest after the order of Melchizedek doesn't have a priestly genealogy. He doesn't come from a priestly father. He doesn't come from a priestly mother. And the Genesis text doesn't tell us when Melchizedek started being priest. And the Genesis text doesn't tell us when he stopped being priest. And the author of Hebrews says, Jesus remains a priest forever. He never stops being a priest. So we know a priest after the order of Melchizedek has an eternal priesthood, an everlasting priesthood. This is good old Jewish exegesis. It won't fly in your exegesis class, at your evangelical college, at your friendly neighborhood evangelical college. Won't fly at your liberal college either, probably. But it works very fine at a Pentecostal college or a holiness college, probably. This is good old allegorical interpretation, like Jews did. And it's perfect. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. By the way, the fact that it says he is likened to the Son of God, to me, undermines the Christophany argument. It doesn't say who, being the Son of God, remains a priest forever. That's not what Hebrews is arguing. But he says the text likens him to the Son of God. To me, so that eliminates the Christophany argument, I would say. The third argument, so there are three basic approaches to Melchizedek. The one is the one that I'm taking. But the author of Hebrews is making an exegetical argument. He's asking, what is a priest after the order of Melchizedek? And he goes to Genesis 14 to figure that out. That's the one I've settled with. The second one is the Christophany argument, which I've said I don't think it fits because he says being likened to the Son of God. He doesn't say that he is the Son of God. And I don't think it's a Christophany. The third one is that Melchizedek is a exalted angelic figure. And we do have a Dead Sea Scroll, 11Q Melchizedek, that seems to suggest that Melchizedek could have been some. The problem with that is that if the author of Hebrews actually thought of Melchizedek as an actual being that wasn't Jesus, then the question is, well, why didn't Melchizedek bring atonement? And why doesn't the text say that Jesus is greater than Melchizedek? I just don't think it works. It doesn't work because then we have an angelic being in competition with Jesus. And there's no trace of anything like that in Hebrews 7. So I go with the exegetical argument interpretation, and that's that, quod erat demonstrandum. That which has been demonstrated, I have demonstrated. So let's have no more of this foolishness. No, never mind. Okay, verse 4. All right, so he's got Melchizedek on the table. Here's what Melchizedek is like. Here's what a priest after the order of Melchizedek is like. A priest after the order of Melchizedek is a king of righteousness. He's a priest king. He's a king of peace. He doesn't have a priestly genealogy, and he never stops being a priest. You could argue for preexistence there too. There wasn't a time where he became a priest either. Although Hebrews 5 seems to imply that Jesus was appointed as priest on the basis of his resurrection. So there's a little tension there. I haven't fully figured that out. But it's if you take these as not being mathematical arguments, but as more pictures, then we don't have to worry about reconciling all the images together. They're pictures. Verse 4. Okay, verse 4. And behold how great this guy was. Now we're talking about the historical Melchizedek. And we're talking about him as a different person from Jesus, right? So not leading me in a Christophany direction here. Behold how great this guy was, to whom Abraham gave a tenth from his spoils, Abraham the patriarch. Verse 5. And on the one hand, those from the sons of Levi who have received the priesthood, in the Old Testament, the sons of Levi were the ones who became the priests. They have the commandment to take a tenth from the people according to the law, that is, from their brothers, although they came out of the loins of Abraham. So you have Abraham gave birth to Isaac. Isaac gave birth to Jacob. Jacob gave birth to Levi and his brothers. The Levitical priests, they take tithes, a tenth, from their brothers, right? Even though they come from the loins of Abraham. Verse 6, however, the one who does not trace their genealogy from them has collected a tenth from Abraham. Melchizedek is not of a Levitical genealogy, and yet he takes a tenth from Abraham. And the one who has the promises, Abraham, we heard about him having the promises back in chapter 6, the one who has the promises, he blessed him. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, the one who has the promises. All right, so by the way, the one not having an ancestry from them. I think verse 6 here, again, this gives us this is the decoder ring. What does it mean for him to not have a genealogy? Verse 6 tells us it means he doesn't have a priestly genealogy. Melchizedek doesn't have a priestly genealogy. The one not having a genealogy from them, that is from the Levites, he takes a tenth from Abraham, and the Levites are in Abraham, we're going to find out in a second, and Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Hold on to it. We're going to get to the conclusion here soon enough. Verse 7. Now, apart from every dispute, it's very clear, he says, that the lesser is blessed by the greater. We're setting up a math equation here of sorts. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, right? Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Therefore, Melchizedek is greater than Abraham because the greater blesses the lesser, right? Verse 8. And here indeed, these people, these men, they receive the tithes and they die. So Levitical priests who take tithes go on to die. But here, in verse 8, it is witnessed that he lives. That is, the priest after Melchizedek lives. It doesn't, the Genesis text didn't say he died. Therefore, priest after the order of Melchizedek lives. And so Jesus, as a priest after the order of Melchizedek, lives on in a greater way than the Levitical priests who die. Okay, verse 9, and so to speak, through Abraham also Levi, the one who receives the tithe, has given the tithe. Verse 10, for still being in the loin of his father he was when he met Abraham. Okay, math equation here. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham because Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Abraham is lesser than Melchizedek because Abraham gives tithes to Melchizedek. Levi is in Abraham, and therefore, by the transitive property of equality, Levi gives tithes to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek, by the transitive property of equality, blesses Levi, who is in Abraham. All of this says is Melchizedek is greater than Levi. Melchizedek is greater than Levi. Melchizedek is greater than Levi because he blesses Abraham. Melchizedek is greater than Levi because Levi gives tithes to Abraham, and Melchizedek is greater than Levi because a priest after Melchizedek doesn't die, whereas Levi died, and the priests in Levi died. All of these things say Melchizedek greater than Levi. By the way, I was going to say something about the dying. Okay, maybe it'll come back to me. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 11. Therefore, if indeed perfection had come through the Levitical priesthood, for the people received the law on the basis of it. When Hebrews talks about the law, this is a difference from Hebrews and Paul. Hebrews focuses on the sacrificial system when Hebrews talks about the law. So the sacrificial law is based upon the Levitical priesthood, is what Hebrews is saying here. What still need would there have been? Since if perfection had come, this is a contrary to fact argument. If the Levitical priesthood had given perfection, had been able to make you cleansed of your sins, had actually been able to make you right with God, if that had been possible, why would there be a need for Psalm 110:4? Why would there still be a need, verse 11, according to the order of Melchizedek, for another priest to arise who is not according to the order, who is not called according to the order of Aaron? So the argument here, again, this is an intricate argument. Psalm 110:4 says there's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And if the Levitical priesthood had been enough, why, Hebrews asks, did there need to be another priesthood? And the answer is, according to the author of Hebrews, that the Levitical priesthood did not bring about perfection. As we'll see in chapter 10, he will argue that the Levitical system of the Old Testament in Leviticus did not actually take away sins. It was not actually effective. He doesn't think it was meant to be effective. He believes that it was always meant to provide a shadow. I know what I was going to say earlier. The historical Melchizedek is not actually a priest after the order of Melchizedek. I mean, this is a little complicated, but let me see if I can communicate this well. The author of Hebrews is asking, what is a priest after the order of Melchizedek? But in asking that question, he is not interpreting Genesis in a contextual way. He's interpreting Genesis in an allegorical way. There is and was a historical Melchizedek, but the historical Melchizedek was not actually a priest after the order of Melchizedek, because the historical Melchizedek was born, the historical Melchizedek died. I think the author of Hebrews thinks this, but certainly I think we would think that. We would think there was a historical Melchizedek who was born and died. But the author of Hebrews is not asking about the historical Melchizedek ultimately. The author of Hebrews is asking, what is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, based upon an interpretation, allegorical interpretation of the Genesis 14 text. And so the only priest after the order of Melchizedek that there has ever been is Jesus. Jesus is the only priest after the order of Melchizedek in all of time and space. All right, okay. So verse 12. For when there is a change of the priesthood, of necessity, there must also be a change of law. So the author of Hebrews is arguing that the law has been changed. There was a law that had the Levitical priesthood, but now the law has been changed. By the way, this chapter is one of those places where we would say, this doesn't really sound like Paul. This is not the kind of argument. When Paul talks about the law, he's usually talking about things like circumcision and food laws and purity laws and things like that. Paul doesn't talk about the law in terms of the sacrificial system by and large. This is a major difference between Paul. It doesn't contradict Paul, but it's different. This is one of the stronger arguments against Paul being the author of Hebrews, I would say. Style is another one. Hebrews 2:2 talks like the author's in a second generation of Christians, where Paul definitely says, "I've seen the Lord." There are a number of reasons why Paul is not generally thought to be the author, but one of the little cumulative arguments is that this is not the way Paul talks about the law in general. All right. So basically, he's saying, because there's a new priesthood, there's a new change, there's a new sheriff in town, there's a new priesthood in town, and therefore the old priesthood is gone. There's no need for Levitical priests anymore. Now, of course, I think I've mentioned, I think that this is written after the temple's destroyed, and so it's not like this is going to be really them's fighting words, because the Levitical priests are gone in all meaningful respects, because the temple's destroyed. Again, that may not be your interpretation, but that's the way I read the context of Hebrews. Verse 13, for concerning him that these things are said, he belonged to a different tribe, that is Jesus. Jesus belonged to a different tribe, from which no one has served the altar. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, verse 14. For it is clear that our Lord has risen from Judah, as to which tribe concerning priests Moses spoke nothing. So this, you can see that this might have been an objection to the idea of Jesus being a priest. Someone might have said, well, Jesus can't be a priest. He's from Judah. You know, he's a king. Fine. You could argue that Jesus is a king, but you can't argue that Jesus is a priest, because the priests come from Levi. Well, isn't this ingenious? Nay, isn't this inspired? I mean, this is brilliant. This is just a fantastically brilliant, ingenious argument that the author of Hebrews is making. And of course, we believe it's true, right? Because somebody might say, well, Jesus can't be a priest. He's from the wrong tribe. And the author of Hebrews says, have you read Psalm 110:4 about how the king who sits, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, which is Jesus, how that king is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Well, what is a priest after the order of Melchizedek? Let's go back to Genesis 14. A priest after the order of Melchizedek doesn't have a priestly genealogy, doesn't have a priestly father, doesn't have a priestly mother. And you know what? They don't have an end of service. All those other Levitical priests, they die, but Jesus doesn't die. He lives forever. This is brilliant. This is just fantastically brilliant. Anyway, verse 15, and even more so, it is extremely clear that if, according to the likeness of Melchizedek, a different priest should arise, hint, hint, he has, it's Jesus, verse 16, who not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, no, but according to the power of an indestructible life. Jesus has an indestructible life. Jesus is not a fleshly, he's not a fleshly priest. He's not an earthly priest like Leviticus. He's a superior priest. Let me step back. What's the argument that Hebrews is making? Hebrews is making the argument that Jesus, and I don't think we realize how revolutionary and how this is a systematic argument. Yes, Paul talks about Jesus being a Passover lamb. Yes, Paul alludes to Jesus as the Day of Atonement sacrifice. This is a systematic replacement of the Levitical system by Jesus. And I don't want the word replacement to throw you off here, because Hebrews sees Jesus as the reality to which the shadow of the law was always pointing. The law was never meant to take away sins. The Levitical system was never meant to take away sins. It was a foreshadowing. It was a anticipation of the reality. It was always looking to Jesus. So don't let that word replacement throw you off, because he's basically saying this was always the reality. Jesus was always the reality. But it's a systematic replacement, again, use a different word if you want, of the Levitical system, because he's a greater priest. That's what we're getting here. We're getting he's the greater priest. He's the priest to end all priests. In fact, there's never been a better priest than him. There's never been an effective priest other than him. And as we're going to see in the next couple chapters, he is in a superior sanctuary. Those earthly sanctuaries were only a shadow of the real sanctuary in heaven, and he gives a superior sacrifice. He, through eternal spirit, offers himself to God. not like these fleshly commandments of these earthly commandments, these fleshly commandments of the Levitical priests. And so it's a three hit wonder: greater priest, greater sanctuary, greater sacrifice. No need for the Levitical system. The Levitical system's gone. The law's been changed. There's a change of law because there's a change of priesthood. That's the argument that we're making here in this chapter. Verse 17, for it is witnessed, and here we're going to get the quote from Psalm 110, 4. For it is witnessed, quote, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And the answer is Jesus. Jesus is the priest after the order of Melchizedek, and therefore the Old Testament Levitical system is done. It's no need for it anymore. So don't cry about the fact, and again, if you read Hebrews the way I do, don't cry about the fact that the temple's been destroyed. It was never meant to take away sins. We have something much more effective than the Levitical system. Right, verse 18. For on the one hand, there is a putting away of the preceding commandment because of the weakness and the uselessness of the same. Now, you may not like this language, but the author of Hebrews is basically saying, the Levitical system didn't work. It's been put away. It's rejected. Athetesis, it's the rejection of it. It's gone. That's pretty strong language. Verse 19, for the law perfected nothing. Wow, that's strong. This is strong language. The law perfected nothing. The Levitical system did not actually work to cleanse your sins. Except this. Now, that's not the end of the story. Verse 19. But it also brought about the introduction of a better hope through which we draw near to God. We can actually draw near to God. We can actually come to God now. We have an effective way to get to God now. And inasmuch as not apart from an oath, for those without an oath are the priests that come and go. This is again an interesting argument. We saw talk about an oath in chapter 6, and here Hebrews again goes to the idea of an oath, that when God installed Jesus as a priest after the order of Melchizedek, he did it with an oath. The Lord swears you are an oath after the order of Melchizedek. And so there's an oath taking on the part of God. But there's no oath like that in regard to the Levitical system. This is very interesting. I mean, you might argue that this is an argument that made sense in their worldview that maybe doesn't make as much sense in our worldview. But the argument is basically that Jesus never took an oath with regard to the Levitical system. God never took an oath with regard to the Levitical system. God never said, and the Levitical system will be here forever, I swear. But God took an oath with regard to the priest after the order of Melchizedek. You are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And therefore, this is another argument that the priesthood of Jesus, the Melchizedekian priesthood of Jesus, is a permanent priesthood because it was made with an oath. Whereas the Levitical system was not. I'm sorry, I had my fingers crossed. No, that's not what I mean. Sorry, it just popped into my head. What he's saying is that with regard to the Levitical system, God never swore that it would be here forever. But with regard to Jesus, he swore that he would be here forever. And therefore, it's a permanent one. It's a permanent priesthood. It's an eternal priesthood. Verse 21. But the one with an oath, Melchizedekian one, through the one who spoke to him, he said, the Lord has sworn and will not repent. The Lord has taken an oath. He has sworn, and he will not repent. He will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. There you have it. That's the end of the story. No such oath with regard to Leviticus. Verse 22. And inasmuch he has become a guarantor of a better covenant. So now here's where we get the idea of Jesus initiating a new covenant. There was an old covenant and there's a new covenant. By the way, the idea of the New Testament, it comes from that language. New Testament is part of the new covenant. That's a Christian connection after the New Testament that was made. New Testament doesn't talk about itself. It doesn't know it's being written. That is, the authors of it don't know, probably. So to talk about a new covenant, and we rightly distinguish the new covenant from the New Testament in that sense, even though they're historically related. Okay, I'm sorry, little tangent there. Footnote. So Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant, better than the Levitical covenant, better than the Old Testament law. And I realize some people are, no, don't say it that way. No. I'm sorry. The author of Hebrews doesn't care about our modern arguments. We get bent over shape. No, don't put it that way. Well, I mean, the author of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, he's doing it. He's doing what he's doing. He can do it. He's inspired too. Verse 23, and those indeed who have become priests, who are many, Levitical ones, because of death are hindered from continuing. This is an argument Hebrews makes. The Levitical priests are ineffective in part because they die, but Jesus doesn't die. Verse 24, but the one who remains, because he remains forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Jesus has a permanent priesthood. He doesn't have end of days. There's not a day when he gives up being in office. Jesus remains the priest forever. Verse 25, wherefore also to save to the uttermost he is able those who approach through him to God, because he always lives to intercede for them. I think I mentioned earlier that the intercession of Jesus, I think, in Hebrews and Romans 8 is probably focused on matters of atonement rather than, I can't find my car keys, although I'm sure Jesus is glad to help you find your car keys. But the intercession of Jesus is much more salvific and having to do with atonement, soteriological. Okay, verse 26 here. We get to near the end of the chapter here. For such a great and fitting high priest for us is Jesus. He is holy. He is without evil. He is undefiled. He has been separated from sinners, and he's higher than the heavens. He's gone to the highest heaven. Remember, he's passed through the skies, having become. Verse 27, who does not have necessity every day, just as the high priest, first on behalf of his own sins to offer a sacrifice, and then on behalf of the people. So again, the idea here is Jesus without sin, therefore he doesn't have to offer for his own sins like the other priests do. But this he did once for all, having offered himself. So it's done. These priests kept doing it. You thought, man, if the Levitical sacrifices had been effective, they would have been able to stop offering them. That's what chapter 10 will say. But they kept doing it over and over and over and over and over again. But you see, now that Jesus has provided the one effective sacrifice of all times, there never has to be a sacrifice again. Which again, if this is written after the temple's destroyed, it's like, oh, phew, I don't have to worry about the fact that the temple's destroyed. Jesus has ended. I mean, it makes sense, right? It makes sense that there wouldn't be a temple now that Jesus has offered his sacrifice, because it's over. It's done. There's no need for it anymore. Verse 28, for the law appoints people as high priests who have weakness. And I think weakness here probably implies sins in this particular context. But the word of the oath that came after the law, it's a word about a son who has been perfected forever. Jesus has been perfected forever. It's done. It's finished. And again, this is not about moral perfection. This is about him having been locked and loaded for atonement, completed. Atonement is now complete. And so it's a forever deal. We don't need any more priests. We've got the priest to end all priests, Jesus, the priest after the order of Melchizedek. And now, with that, this podcast is also completed. This has been Through the Bible in 10 years. We'll see you, Lord willing, next week.